The year was 1829, and the Delmarva Peninsula sat quietly under a wide gray sky. The land itself seemed caught between two worlds, half claimed by the order of towns and farms, half lost to the marshes and thickets that crept along the rivers. It was a place of small homesteads, dirt paths worn by wagons, and whispers that carried farther than the wind. For those who lived there, life felt steady on the surface, but beneath that surface was a current of unease that most people chose not to speak of at first glance. Nothing about this world looked unusual. Farmers rose before dawn, their hands rough and strong, working fields that gave just enough to keep families fed. Women tended to homes, sewing clothes by candlelight and watching over children who played until dusk pulled them indoors. Sundays were for church, where sermons spoke of salvation and morality, but often left out the darker truths of how people survived. Slavery existed like a shadow in this region, not always as open as in the Deep South, but still deeply tied to the lives of many. Runaways tried to slip north, and whispers of bounty hunters followed close behind them. Fear lingered even in freedom. Along the Nanticoke River, there stood a house that drew attention in quiet ways. Large by the standards of its time, with thick wooden beams and a yard that stretched wide, it looked like a place built for wealth and strength. Those who passed by often lowered their eyes, moving quickly, because they knew something was not right about that house. No one spoke of it openly, yet everyone knew its reputation. Strange movements at night, wagons carrying more than grain, the sounds of crying that the wind carried farther than it should have. The woman who ruled that house seemed both ordinary and terrifying. She was known to many, though not for kindness or warmth. Her presence was sharp, her eyes like cold iron, and her words cut deeper than most men dared to answer. In a time when women were often expected to bow their heads, she did the opposite. She demanded control, and she got it. Behind her, rumors of violence and cruelty spread, but in public she carried herself with confidence, as if daring anyone to question her. People whispered her name in fear, and when they did, they spoke it quietly, Patty Cannon. But to see her only as a woman with power was to miss the truth of how deeply twisted her life had become. For years, she had lived in control of land, control of people, and control of fear itself. Her home was more than a farm. It was a trap. The ground around it carried secrets, buried deeper than roots, and the walls had held screams that no prayers could silence. Still, to the outside world, life went on. Markets bustled in nearby towns, where families came to trade and gossip. Children played near the edges of fields, chasing one another with the kind of laughter that made it easy to believe the world was safe. And yet, in that laughter, in the simple routines of daily life, there were cracks. Runaways passed through in silence, their eyes wide with hope and terror. Families lived in fear of losing loved ones not just to poverty or disease, but to human hands far crueler. And always, the road seemed to lead back to that one house. What made it worse was how normal it all seemed. Patty had a way of making her world look like it belonged, of blending cruelty with routine. Neighbors might have wondered why certain wagons moved through at night, or why strangers disappeared after passing her land, but they learned not to ask. Fear silenced more people than violence ever could. And so the image of normal life continued. Fields worked, meals cooked, children tucked into bed, while somewhere nearby, another life was being destroyed. For those who crossed her path, there was no escape. She was not just one person, but the center of a network, a ring of people who helped her hunt, capture, and profit. It was said that her cruelty had no limits, that she would turn on anyone if it served her, even family. Yet still she stood at the edge of society, untouchable, a woman who turned the laws of power upside down. She wore no mask of kindness, yet people still looked away, unwilling to bring her wrath upon themselves. In the stillness of the 1820s, when the world around her clung to routines that seemed fragile at best, Patty Cannon represented something darker, something that thrived not in chaos, but in control. Her strength was not born of madness alone, but but of a cold understanding of how fear could rule better than any weapon. Those who lived near her could sense it, even if they tried not to admit it. And so the stage was set. A land caught between freedom and slavery, between community and silence. A woman whose name carried fear like a curse. Families who wanted only to live in peace, yet lived in the shadow of something unspeakable. At first, it looked like normal life, simple, ordinary, unremarkable. But beneath it, beneath the steady rhythms of work and worship, was a world ready to unravel, held hostage by a woman who hunted in the dark. The Delmarva Peninsula was a place where silence was safer than tea. Ruth. By 1829, the air itself seemed heavy with what people would not say out loud. Behind closed doors, though, the silence cracked. In Patty Cannon's house, the tensions that had once hidden beneath a surface of control began to rise, and every secret, every choice seemed to tighten around her like a noose she did not yet see. It started with whispers that turned into warnings. Runaways spoke of the Cannon Gang, a family ring that stretched across borders, feeding on the fear of those desperate for freedom. Patty was not alone. She had blood ties and loyal men who worked under her name. Her son-in-law, Joe Johnson, was just as ruthless, and together they created an enterprise that turned people into property. Patty called it business. But even among criminals, her hunger for power seemed unsettling. She wanted more than money. She wanted control, the kind of control that crushed hope before it even sparked. Inside her household, the atmosphere was charged. Relatives who lived under her roof felt the weight of her presence. She spoke little of love and much of obedience. Any warmth had long burned away, leaving only a cold grip on those around her. To disobey was to risk her wrath, and even family knew better than to test her. Still, small cracks began to show. Joe Johnson was ambitious, too, and sometimes his arrogance collided with her authority. He fancied himself clever, but Patty knew he relied on her name, her house, her reputation of terror. Each time his voice rose louder. Each time he made choices without her approval, her anger deepened. Yet the threats from inside her circle were nothing compared to the storm rising outside. Laws were shifting slowly but surely, and whispers of abolition reached even into Maryland and Delaware. Slave catchers and traffickers still thrived, but their world was beginning to face scrutiny. Ordinary citizens, too, grew restless. Not everyone was blind to Patty's deeds. Rumors spread like wildfire, wagons of chained men and women disappearing at night, children vanishing from roads, families tore apart. The fear was thick, but so was resentment. Some wanted her stopped. Others just prayed her gaze would never turn toward them. But Patty could feel the change. She was a woman used to bending people to her will, and any hint of challenge ignited a rage inside her. Where others saw shifting times, she saw betrayal. To her, control was survival. And survival meant crushing opposition before it grew too strong. Her punishments became harsher, her threats sharper. She demanded loyalty from her circle, but the cracks widened. Some followed her out of fear, others for profit, but more than a few began to question how much longer her reign could last. One of the moments that marked this rising tension came when a runaway boy was dragged into her yard. No older than 12, his wrists bound with rope. He had tried to flee toward freedom, but instead, he found himself caught in her web. Neighbors heard his cries, sharp and desperate, but none dared to interfere. Patty did not simply punish. She made examples. That night, as the boy's sobs turned to silence, those within her household looked away, uneasy. Some swore they saw in her face not just anger, but enjoyment. And in that moment, the loyalty of a few began to falter. If she was willing to destroy a child without hesitation, how long before she turned on them? Financial struggles also pressed in. Though Patty profited from the TR, of human lives, debts, and disputes gnawed at her. Her network required bribes, transportation, weapons, all costly. And as suspicion grew, keeping her operation hidden demanded more. Each deal carried a higher risk, and the profits that once flowed easily began to dwindle. Greed twisted with desperation, driving her decisions to grow more reckless. She no longer cared for careful planning. She wanted results, and she wanted them fast. That urgency left marks, and it made her easier to notice. Hidden grudges also fed the fire. Old neighbors, long afraid to act, began to whisper louder. Families who had lost loved ones suspected her hand in it, and though they lacked proof, they carried the bitterness of grief. Men in town spoke in hushed tones of organizing, of bringing evidence to the law. But even as resistance stirred, fear kept it fractured. Patty's reputation was her strongest weapon. Inside, her family carried their own secrets. Some of her kin despised what she had become, but felt trapped. One daughter, caught between loyalty and horror, watched her mother's cruelty and wondered how much of that darkness lived in her own blood. Joe Johnson, bold and reckless, sometimes drank too much and spoke too freely, letting slip details that could undo them all. His arrogance made him dangerous, not only to himself but to the entire Cannon ring. Each slip of his tongue, each careless move, fed Patty's paranoia. She began to trust less and suspect more. It was during those private hours that her darker side truly revealed itself. At night, when the lamps flickered low, she paced the halls of her house like a restless spirit. Her mind circled betrayal, punishment, and control. Sleep eluded her, replaced by schemes of how to tighten her grip. To her, everyone was a tool or a threat. Her children, her grandchildren, her allies, none were safe from her suspicion. The more the outside world pressed against her, the more she pressed against those closest to her. The breaking point drew nearer each day, even if those around her did not yet see it. Each runaway she captured, each punishment she delivered, each careless move her allies made, it all stacked higher, forming a tower bound to collapse. Her enemies were watching, her friends were doubting, and her own blood began to fear what she might do next. The land itself seemed to reflect this growing unrest. Nights were colder, the roads darker, and the silence heavier. Neighbors avoided her property altogether, crossing fields to keep from passing too close. Even the river seemed more ominous, its waters carrying secrets that would not stay buried forever. And so the tension grew, not from a single act, but from many, each fueled by greed, cruelty, fear, and the shifting winds of society. Patty Cannon had built her world on control, but as the years pressed on, that control began to slip. She clung harder, grasping at whatever power she could still hold. What she did not realize was that every act of violence, every choice of cruelty, was not just building her empire, but also digging her grave. The night that marked the breaking point carried no storm, no thunderclap to warn what was coming. The sky was clear, the stars sharp above the Delmarva fields, yet the air itself seemed charged, thick as if holding its breath. Patty Cannon's house loomed against the darkness, its wood. In frame, a silhouette of menace. Inside, shadows stretched long across the walls, and the flicker of lanterns made the rooms seem alive with unease. That day had begun like any other, but small things had shifted, cracks opening wider. Joe Johnson had returned late, the wheels of his wagon caked in mud, and the whispers of his drunken boasting followed close behind. He had spoken too freely in town, dropping hints of their trade, laughing at the fear in other men's eyes. To Joe, intimidation was power. To Patty, it was weakness. A loose tongue could undo everything she had built. The tension between them had simmered all evening, her sharp words clashing with his arrogance. By the time night fell, the silence in the house was not peace, but a warning die was then that the latest captives were dragged inside. 2 men and a young woman, their wrists bound, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion. They had been caught on the road north, perhaps only days from slipping free. Their eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Patty's gaze locked onto them, cold and measured. She saw not people, but property, profits to be divided, reminders of her control. But something about the woman unsettled her. She was young, no older than Patty's daughters once were, and in her eyes there was defiance rather than fear. Even bound and beaten, she stared back at Patty with a fire that did not bow. That look pierced through the hardened shell Patty had built around herself. It was not pity she felt, it was rage. Rage that someone could meet her gaze and not cower. Rage that, even chained, this girl carried something Patty could not crush. Joe noticed it too. He laughed, mocking Patty's stiffness, taunting the girl, grabbing her chin with a rough hand as if to prove his own dominance. The girl spat at him, her defiance reckless but pure. Joe's face twisted. Ed in fury, and in that moment, something shifted in the room. Patty's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Sharp and commanding, she ordered Joe to stop. But he didn't. His pride outweighed her authority, and his hand raised higher, ready to strike. That defiance, the same kind she hated in the girl, ignited something uncontrollable in Patty. For years, she had ruled by fear, by silence, by control. But in that instant, control slipped, giving way to raw violence. The crime unfolded in chaos. Patty's fury exploded. She seized the iron poker from the fireplace, her grip white-knuckled, her breath heavy and sharp. Without pause, without thought, she swung. The crack of metal against bone filled the room, a sound that silenced everything else. Joe collapsed with a grunt, blood seeping across the floorboards. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The captive stared in horror, the girl's eyes wide, her defiance now drowned in shock. Patty stood over him, chest heaving, eyes blazing with something close to madness. The iron slipped from her hand, clattering onto the floor. She had crossed a line she could not step back from. Her empire, built on fear, had turned inward. She had destroyed not just an enemy, but one of her own. Inside her mind, thoughts clashed like storms. For years, she had demanded loyalty, obedience, and silence. Now she had shown that even those closest to her could be destroyed if they threatened her control. Part of her told herself it was justice, that Joe's arrogance, his recklessness, had endangered them all. Another part whispered what she could not silence, that she had lost control, that in her rage she had become the very thing she feared, weak. The room itself seemed to breathe with panic. The captives whimpered, shrinking into corners, their chains rattling against the floor. Family members who had watched in shock now scrambled. Some rushed to her side, trying to rationalize, to soothe her, while others wrecked. Oiled, their fear of her deepened beyond repair. Whispers of "what do we do now?" cut through the heavy silence. Patty, trembling but unwilling to show it, barked orders. The body had to be moved, the floor scrubbed, the story buried before dawn. She commanded as if the world still bent to her will, but the cracks were visible now. Her voice shook beneath the weight of what she had done. Blood, once hidden beneath her deeds, now stains her own home in plain sight. The immediate aftermath was chaos dressed as control. Joe's lifeless body was dragged out, the dirt swallowing his presence like it had swallowed so many others before him. Water and rags scrubbed at the blood, but the stains clung stubbornly to the wood. No amount of scrubbing could wash away the truth. Those who helped her did so with trembling hands, not loyalty. Their silence was no longer obedience. It was survival. The captives, though still chained, had witnessed everything. Their terror deepened, but alongside it was something else, a glimmer of understanding that Patty's power was not untouchable. She could lose control. She could kill not just them, but her own. For the first time, the shadow of her name wavered. In her mind, though, Patty began to weave the story differently. She told herself this was necessary, that Joe's recklessness had forced her hand. She told herself it was strength, not weakness, to destroy anyone who threatened her rule. Yet, deep down, the image of his face, the sound of the iron striking, lingered. Each time she closed her eyes, it replayed sharper, louder. And with it came something she could not admit. Fear. Not fear of the law, not even fear of enemies outside, but fear of herself. The house, once her fortress, felt different now. Every creak of the wood seemed louder. Every shadow stretched longer. Her own family looked at her differently, their eyes holding the quest. Ion they dared not speak. If she could kill him, what would stop her from killing them? That night marked the unraveling. Patty had always believed she could control her world with fear, but now fear turned inward. She could command her circle to clean the blood, to bury the body, to silence the witnesses, but she could not command away the unease that had settled into the walls of her house. The empire she built no longer felt unshakable. It felt like it was rotting from within. The crime had been brutal, sudden, and irreversible. It was not planned, not calculated like so many of her cruel acts before. It was born of rage, of losing control, of refusing to be defied. And in that moment, Patty Cannon showed the world, though only those closest saw it, that even the most feared tyrants could fall victim to their own violence. The house that once carried Patty Cannon's pride grew quiet after that night, but the silence was not peace. It was a silence weighted with fear, suspicion, and the memory of blood that no scrubbing could erase. The floorboards still seemed to whisper of what had happened. Every creak in the night felt like a reminder. Every flicker of a lamp like an accusing I in the days that followed. Denial became the first shield. Patty told herself she had acted out of necessity, that Joe Johnson's arrogance would have destroyed them all if she had not acted. To her, it was not murder, but correction, a lesson in loyalty. She repeated this story to her family and those who helped her bury the truth. Yet the more she spoke it, the less convincing it sounded, even to herself. Her voice carried the tone of someone trying to make a lie into truth. Her family absorbed the shock in their own ways. Some clung to her narrative, afraid to question her, afraid to admit they had seen her lose control. Others withdrew, their eyes avoiding hers, their words clipped and distant. A granddaughter, young and impressionable, could not stop staring at the spot on the floor where Joe had fallen. She asked no questions, but her silence was louder than any accusation. The fear of what she had witnessed grew into a quiet dread that spread through the house. The captives who had seen the act were shaken as well. Their terror deepened in a moment, but in the days that followed, they carried with them something different. The knowledge that Patty was not unbreakable. They saw her rage, her slip, her frantic attempts to cover what she had done. They saw not just a tyrant, but a woman unraveling. That knowledge was dangerous. Though they remained in chains, outside the walls, whispers traveled faster than wagons. Neighbors who had long suspected Patty of cruelty now spoke with more certainty. Stories of wagons moving by night, of children and adults disappearing, began to gain sharper detail. Rumors of Joe Johnson's sudden absence stirred questions. People asked why a man known for his loud presence had vanished without explanation. Some said he had fled debts. Others hinted he had crossed Patty and paid the price. Fear still kept many silent, but doubt spread, and with it came a shifting tide. The legal world, too, began to circle closer. For years, Patty had bribed and intimidated her way through suspicions, keeping lawmen at bay. But the cracks in her power widened. Evidence of her trafficking surfaced as families cried out for justice, their grief no longer contained by silence. Mothers who had lost children, fathers who had watched loved ones disappear, spoke louder. The weight of years of cruelty pressed against the law. For Patty herself, the psychological toll grew heavy. She had always ruled by control, yet now she felt it slipping. Nights were sleepless. She wandered through her house, hearing echoes of Joe's final grunt, the sound of iron crushing bone. She told herself it had been necessary, but her dreams betrayed her. In them, Joe returned, his skull shattered, his eyes accusing. She would wake with a start, sweat soaking her clothes, her hands trembling. Fear crept into the cracks of her iron will. Her family suffered quietly under her reign. A daughter, once loyal, began to withdraw, weighed down by guilt for staying silent. She wondered if by protecting her mother, she had doomed herself and her children to the same darkness. The younger ones absorbed the fear without words, learning that silence was survival, that the cost of speaking was too high. The house became a prison, not just for the captives, but for everyone inside. The community outside shifted too. Where once Patty's name was spoken in whispers of fear, it now carried disgust and outrage. The crimes, long suspected, began to take shape in public opinion. What had once been hidden in shadows now entered daylight. Each disappearance connected back to her house, and each rumor took on the weight of truth. She was no longer untouchable. She was a monster in the eyes of those who had once avoided naming her. The aftermath spread wider than Patty could control. Lawmen finally gathered enough courage and evidence to act. When they moved against her, it was not with hesitation, but with a sense of overdue justice. Shackles closed around her wrists, the same iron that she had once ordered placed on others. The irony was sharp, and though she tried to meet it with defiance, her eyes betrayed her fear. Her arrest shocked even those who had lived closest to her crimes. To see Patty Cannon, the woman who had ruled through terror, dragged into custody, was to see power stripped bare. Some of her family wept. Others felt a bitter sense of relief. For the community, it was both justice and a haunting reminder of how long she had thrived unpunished in the jails of Delaware. Patty sat in her final days with walls colder than any she had built. The denial that had once shielded her cracked. Alone in her cell, she was forced to face the weight of what she had done. Not just the crime of Joe Johnson's murder, but the coup. Countless lives she had shattered. Some say she confessed, her words laced with bitterness. Others claim she carried her pride to the end. But in her silence, in the heavy hours of waiting, guilt gnawed at her, whether she admitted it or not. The ripple effects lasted long after her death. Families of the stolen carried grief through generations. The community carried the shame of silence, of looking away too long. Patty Cannon's name lived on, not as power, but as a warning. She had believed herself unbreakable, yet in the end, her empire collapsed, leaving only scars and stories of fear. The aftermath of her crime was more than punishment. It was a mirror held to the world around her. It showed how power unchecked could rot a community, how fear could silence justice, and how one woman's cruelty could scar not just her victims, but everyone touched by her shadow. In the falling action of her story, there was no victory, no redemption. Only the heavy truth of what fear and violence can create when left to grow too long. When the iron gates closed behind Patty Cannon for the last time, it was as if a spell finally broke across the Delmarva Peninsula. For years, her name had lived like a shadow, whispered in fear, carried in the silence of neighbors who knew too much but dared too little. Now she was confined to a cold cell, no longer a ruler in her home, but a prisoner awaiting judgment. The fall of such a figure was both shocking and strangely inevitable. Her legal consequences came with a weight that matched the scale of her crimes. Testimonies surfaced from those who had once worked under her or suffered under her hand. Old rumors hardened into evidence. Families stepped forward with stories of loved ones who had vanished after passing near her land. Joe Johnson's sudden disappearance, once cloaked in excuses, now stood as a wound that pointed directly at her. The law that had once turned its head could no longer ignore the truth. For Patty, there would be no trial that played out dramatically. History records that she died in jail before she could stand before a jury, some claiming she poisoned herself rather than face judgment, others insisting illness consumed her. Whichever way it ended, her death closed her story without the formal declaration of guilt the courts might have given. Yet no one doubted her crimes. Her name had already become infamous, her deeds undeniable. Justice came not in the form of a verdict, but in the collapse of her reign and the certainty that she would never harm another soul again. Her family bore scars that went deeper than the law could touch. Children and grandchildren were left to live in the shadow of her name, carrying the burden of what she had done. Some tried to disappear into anonymity, changing their lives to escape the stain. Others lived with the quiet guilt of knowing they had stood by her, whether out of fear or loyalty, and let her cruelty flourish. The house that once held her power stood not as a home, but as a reminder, its walls remembered for screams rather than laughter, for the victims justice was incomplete. Those who had been stolen from their families could not be returned. The children who vanished, the men and women sold into the depths of slavery, remained as holes in the lives of those who loved them. The crime did not end with Patty's death. It lingered in the empty chairs, the lost names, the broken legacies. Her downfall brought an end to her violence, but could not erase what had been done. The broader impact of her crimes rippled outward into society. Patty Cannon's capture and death forced communities to reckon with their silence. For years, people had looked away, choosing fear over confrontation. Her story laid bare the cost of that silence. Neighbors who once lowered their eyes when her wagons passed had to face the truth teach. And by not speaking, they had allowed her cruelty to grow. The law, too, was forced into reflection. The existence of her gang highlighted how weak enforcement and corruption had allowed trafficking to thrive. Her reign showed the cracks in a system that claimed justice, but often looked the other way when fear or profit stood in the way. Her story also illuminated the brutal crossroads of slavery and crime in early America. While slavery itself was a legal institution, Patty Cannon's actions showed how greed could twist even that cruelty further, turning human lives into black market profits. She exploited the desperation of the enslaved, hunting them when they tried to grasp freedom, and in doing so, revealed the ugliest edges of a society built on power and ownership. Her legacy was not just one of murder, but of amplifying the pain of a system already rooted in inhumanity, but on a human level. Her downfall underscored timeless truths about power and morality. Patty Cannon was a woman in a time when women rarely held authority. Yet she carved power not through respect or compassion, but through fear and violence. She inverted expectations, not to challenge injustice, but to deepen it. Her cruelty demonstrated how power without conscience corrupts absolutely. The same iron will that made her formidable also made her monstrous, at the same time. Her story speaks to the dangers of silence and complicity. Neighbors who suspected but stayed quiet, family members who feared her but obeyed, even lawmen who accepted bribes. Together they formed the world that allowed her crimes to last as long as they did. Her reign was not hers alone. It thrived because others chose survival over resistance. In that way, her crimes were not just personal but societal, exposing the frailty of morality when weighed against fear. Looking back, the name Patty Cannon endures as a symbol of both cruelty and consequence. She stands as proof that even the most feared tyrants eventually fall, that control built on violence crumbles when the truth comes to light. Yet her story is also a warning that justice delayed leaves deep scars, that silence can be as destructive as action. The tale of Patty Cannon forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human behavior. How does someone choose cruelty so completely that it defines their entire life? How does fear bind people into silence, even when faced with obvious evil? And perhaps most haunting of all, what would have happened if those around her had spoken sooner, acted sooner, refused to allow fear to rule them? In the end, her story is not just about one woman. It is about a community, a society, a time when power was too often allowed to crush humanity. Her death closed her chapter, but the lessons remain. Justice, when it finally came, was incomplete but undeniable. And the world that once whispered her name in fear now remembers it as a curse, a reminder of how far cruelty can go when no one dares to stop it.